making seam position and pile direction choices, and generating the cutting plan. MasterPiece Cloud is designed for use in the customer's home. Seam and pile direction choices can be made while in the home and approved by the customer. Once a cutting plan has been generated, the job is ready to be costed. This video begins at the point where all rooms and stairways have been drawn and dimensioned, and all doors and risers applied to these rooms. At this point, the floor plan button is greened, indicating that we are ready to go to the floor plan to make our choices of seam and pile direction for the various rooms. We select to go to the floor plan, and on arrival, the floor plan is showing as here, with the seam and pile button greened to indicate that seam and pile choices is the next thing to do. We select the seam and pile button to make seam and pile choices for a 4-metre roll width. We get shown an option for the dining room. This has two possible seam positions indicated by the dotted line and the dashed line. We can alternatively select option 2, where we see options with the pile running up or down. Note that the option offered keeps the seam away from the doorway. We decide that this isn't the seam position that we want, and we revert to looking at option 1. We need to make a choice between these before the confirm button will appear for this room, and we choose to select this one. The dotted line goes black to indicate it's been selected. The other option is still available for selection, but it's now greyed out, indicating it's not the chosen one. For the seam option, the pile direction can only go left or right. However, we would prefer the pile to point towards the door, so we tap on the arrow until we get a pile constraint applied towards the door. The confirm button is now available and greened up for us to confirm this seam position, and we confirm. The focus now moves to the living room. We can see there are two different seam options very near to the edge of the room. We select the top seam option because it looks preferable to the lower option. When we select to confirm, the system recognises an opportunity to squeeze to avoid a seam altogether, and we get prompted as follows. When we select to squeeze, we get shown that the squeeze has occurred. It says the allowance was squeezed down from 10 cm to 6 cm. The squeeze has only occurred in the across roll direction. The allowance remains at 10 cm in the along roll direction. With seam choices made for all rooms, the button to save these choices is now greened, and we select to save. We will now look at how to modify the seam choices we have just made and saved. We select the Seam and Pile button again and select to edit the seaming solution. We could choose the lower seam option for the dining room at this point, but we will instead select to look at the second seaming option. The second seam option offers us the following. Because the filler piece would be quite thin and the seam quite long, we are offered two cross joins. We can click the plus button if we want more cross joins like so, or the minus button so that there will be just one cross join. However, we will decide to allow two cross joins. We decide to have the pile constrained downwards, and as we are now happy, we click the confirm button. If we want to make an alteration to the living room as well, we use the drop down to select the living room. With focus now on the living room, we can select to unsqueeze the allowance if we wish, and when we have done so, we regain a seam line. However, we decide to have a look at the second option for the living room, and as we prefer this seam position, we select to confirm it. Now the Save button is greened up to prompt us to save the overall seam and pile options, and we select to save. The floor plan continues to show the seam and pile direction choices that have been made. The system is now ready to have a new cutting plan created, which will use the seam and pile options we have designated. The Create Rooms view also shows the selections we have made. For instance, the dining room shows the chosen seam option thus, and the selected pile constraint. Once the seam options have been done, we are ready to go to the planning view to do the cutting plan. We see the planning button is greened up to prompt us to do this. At the planning view, we select to request a plan. We select to use the 4 meter roll width, and the planning gets generated on the cloud server. When the plan gets returned to us, we can see what the wastage percentage is. We can view the plan in landscape to review the wastage, and we can see it in portrait as it will be printed. We may wish to create a cutting plan for a different roll width so that we can compare wastages. To do this, we need to choose seam and pile directions for a 5 meter roll width, so we return to the floor plan and we select to do seam options for a different width, and this time select to use a 5 meter roll width. We want to run the pile direction so as to have no seam in the dining room, and we select to have the pile going down, and we confirm. For the living room, we can see from the 4-way arrow that we can have any pile direction and still require no seam. However, we want to run the pile in the same direction as the living room, so we keep tapping on the arrow until we get a pile constraint in the required direction. We now have both rooms with their piles running in the same direction, and we confirm the living room, and then we save the overall choices for the 5 meter width. We create the 5 meter plan, and then we can compare the wastage of the two plans. We are now ready to get a breakdown of all the cost items for the job. This is covered in a separate video. In this video, we are familiarised with the controls for doing a first-off choice of seam and pile directions. We have seen how to do a subsequent edit of our seam options if we need to, and also how to create seam options for a different roll width. We have seen how a cutting plan can be created for each width of interest and the wastages compared.